Harlan Grier slapped a pregnant nurse in a dark hallway, thinking he was invisible. He didn't see the technician behind the drywall already draining his offshore accounts before the sunrise. Some build power with money. Others build it with fear. I am Alfred. I tell stories of the shadows, the streets, the silence, and the wars, where influence is stronger than weapons. Subscribe and walk with me. The VIP wing smells of industrial lemon and cold air. Harlan Grier stands there. His shoes are hand-stitched, his eyes are dead. He's talking, but it sounds like a threat. Nila Okafor is backed against a supply cart. She's holding a tablet, her knuckles are white. Then the impact. A sharp, hollow sound against her jaw. Grier doesn't look back. Update the server, Nila, he says, before I update your career into the dirt. He doesn't see the shadow in the ceiling panel. Kasim Vance is holding a soldering iron. He isn't moving. He's watching the data packets climb on his handheld screen. Grier thinks he's the king of the mountain. But Kasim just saw the mogul's login credentials reflected in a glass cabinet. It's not just a password. It's the master key to Grier's entire life. Kasim clicks connect. The clock just started. The air up here, it's different. Dust, old insulation, the smell of copper wires and trapped heat. Kasim held his breath. He didn't move, he couldn't. Right below him, just 2 inches of acoustic tile away, was Harlan Grier. The man looked perfect, not a hair out of place. And then the sound. That sharp, sickening crack of a hand hitting skin. Nila didn't scream, she just gasped, a small, broken sound that stayed in the back of her throat. Kasim's grip tightened on his phone, his knuckles went white. But then he forced himself to go cold. He had to. Anger gets you caught, data gets you even. He tilted the camera lens through the narrow gap in the ceiling grid. He got it all. The way Grier adjusted his cufflink after the strike. The way he looked at Nila like she was a bug on his windshield. Update the server, Nila. Grier's voice was a low crawl. Before I update your career into the dirt. Grier turned. He walked toward the window. He thought he was alone. He thought the walls were thick. But Kasim wasn't just watching. He was reaching out. He pulled a small black device from his pocket, a signal cloner. 3 feet, that's all he needed. The device hummed, a tiny vibration against his palm. Syncing. 90%. 98%. Connected. Grier's phone was now Kasim's phone. Every text, every call, every secret. Kasim looked down at his handheld screen. He expected bank codes, maybe offshore transfers. But what he saw, it made his blood turn to ice. The phone wasn't pinging a bank. It was sending a steady, encrypted burst of data to the local police precinct, the 4th district. But then something felt off. The data wasn't a report. It wasn't a call for help. It was a heartbeat, a live location feed. Grier wasn't just a billionaire. He was being tracked. Or he was the one holding the leash. And that's when Kasim saw the outgoing message on his screen. The witness is non-compliant. Send the cleanup crew. Kasim looked at the time stamp. 10 seconds ago. And then, the sound of heavy boots started echoing in the hallway. They weren't stopping at the desk. They were coming straight for the service door. Kasim looked at the ceiling exit, then back at the screen. Why was a private equity mogul calling the police to finish his dirty work? What happened next wasn't part of the plan. The doorknob turned. Kasim went silent. Dead silent. The boots, they stopped right outside the door. Kasim didn't breathe, he couldn't. He stayed pressed against the cold metal of a ventilation duct, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked down at the handheld screen. The data was still streaming. Grier was gone. He walked out of the room like nothing happened. But the phone, it was still giving up its secrets. Kasim scrolled fast. He wasn't looking for bank accounts anymore. He was looking for a name. And that's when he saw it. Project Lantern. It looked like a standard payroll file. Boring, just names and numbers. But then he looked closer. The payments weren't going to doctors. They weren't going to nurses. Every single name on that list was a member of the hospital's night shift security team. And the amounts? Thousands every week. But here's the thing, the money wasn't coming from the hospital. It was coming from a shell company registered to Grier. A slush fund. Kasim's stomach dropped. If Grier was paying the guards, who were they really working for? Nila was still down there, standing in the middle of the hallway, trembling. Kasim wanted to shout. He wanted to tell her to run. But then something felt off. The security monitor in the corner of his screen flickered. He saw the guards, 3 of them. They weren't checking on Nila. They didn't even look at her as they passed. They were looking up, scanning the ceiling panels, checking the service hatches. One of them pointed a high-powered flashlight right at the vent where Kasim was hiding. The beam of light cut through the dark, missing his face by an inch. And that's when Kasim realized. Grier didn't just know he was there. Grier had already sent the cleanup crew to find the man in the ceiling. What happened next changed everything. The guard reached for his radio. "We have a heat signature in Sector 4, he whispered. Kasim looked at his exit. It was blocked. He looked at the phone. There was one more file. A photo. He opened it, and his breath hitched. It was a picture of him, entering the building 3 hours ago. How did they get that so fast? He wasn't the one hunting Grier. Grier had been hunting him from the moment he walked through the door. The flashlight beam started to sweep back toward the vent. Slowly, steady, Kasim gripped his soldering iron. He had 5 seconds to disappear, or the ghost account wouldn't be the only thing getting buried tonight. The flashlight beam brushed his shoulder. Kasim didn't move. He didn't blink. He just waited for the guard to look away for 1 single second. Then he moved. He didn't go for the exit. He went deeper into the vents, toward the garage uplink. Harlan Grier was already outside. He was walking toward his black limousine, checking his watch, looking bored. Like he hadn't just ruined a woman's life 10 minutes ago. He stepped into the back seat. The heavy door clicked shut. The driver hit the ignition. Nothing. He tried again. Silence. Kasim was hunched over his handheld screen in the dark, fingers flying across the terminal. He wasn't just blocking the engine. He was rewriting the car's brain. The ECU, the central computer, it was his now. But then, Grier started to realize something was wrong. He grabbed the door handle. It wouldn't budge. He tried the other side. Locked. The child safety locks, the deadbolts, the reinforced security glass. Grier was trapped in a $300,000 cage. And that's when Kasim pushed the final command. The car's infotainment screen flickered. It stayed dark for a moment, just long enough for Grier to see his own reflection in the glass. And then the text appeared. Bright white, bleeding into the darkness of the cabin. You forgot to apologize. Grier froze. He looked at the dashboard, then he looked at the tinted windows. He started pounding on the glass, screaming at the driver. But the driver couldn't hear him. The internal intercom was dead. What happened next made Grier's face go pale. The car's horn started to honk. Once, twice. A steady, rhythmic blast that started drawing everyone's attention. The people on the sidewalk stopped. They started pointing. They started taking out their phones. Grier was the man who hated being seen, and now he was the center of a circus. But then something felt off. Kasim looked at the car's external sensors on his screen. A black SUV was pulling up behind the limo. No plates, darker windows. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the creditors. And that's when Kasim saw the data packet on the SUV's frequency. They weren't there to help Grier get out. They were there to make sure he stayed in. Kasim's finger hovered over the unlock button. If he let Grier out, the mogul would hunt him down. If he kept him in, Grier might not survive the night. Why was Grier's own backup team suddenly turning into his jailers? The SUV door opened. Kasim held his breath. The clock was ticking. Kasim watched the screen. His eyes were burning, but he couldn't blink. The security feed showed Nila. She wasn't running, she wasn't screaming. Two of Grier's paid guards were walking her down a service corridor. They weren't being rough, not yet, they were just guiding her. They stopped at a heavy oak door near the end of the wing. A brass plate on the front said, "Room 404. Kasim frowned. He pulled up the building's digital blueprints. He scrolled through the fourth floor, 401, 402, 403. Then nothing. The map jumped straight to the supply closet. Room 404 didn't exist. Not on the official plans, not on the city's fire safety map. But then, the door on the screen opened. Nila was pushed inside. Kasim's fingers blurred across the keyboard. He had to get eyes inside that room. He bypassed the local hub, tapped into the private internal circuit, and the feed flickered to life. It wasn't a hospital room. It was a suite, luxury furniture, private monitors. And in the center, a bed. Nila stood there. Her hand went to her mouth. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. Kasim zoomed in on the patient's face. The man was pale, hooked up to 3 different machines that weren't on the hospital's procurement list. But it was the name on the digital chart that stopped Kasim's heart. Arthur Grier, Harlan's father. The man who'd had a state funeral 3 years ago. The man the papers said died in a plane crash. He was alive. Well, mostly. But then something felt off. Kasim looked at the readouts on the side monitor. The elder Grier wasn't being treated, he was being maintained. And that's when Kasim saw the legal documents on the bedside table. They weren't medical records. They were power of attorney papers, unsigned. Harlan wasn't hiding his father to save him. He was keeping him hidden, because the old man was the only one who could stop the liquidation of the firm. What happened next was a mistake. Nila reached out to touch the old man's hand. The monitor spiked. A silent alarm went off on Kasim's handheld. A notification from Grier's cloned phone, "Intruder in the vault, terminate protocol." Kasim looked back at the hallway. The guards were already drawing their weapons. If Harlan's father was a ghost, then Nila was about to become one too. Why was Grier keeping a dead man on life support, just to rob him? The door to the suite began to lock from the outside. Kasim had to move, now. The screen, it just went black. Not a glitch, not a crash. Dark. Kasim tapped the glass, once, twice. Nothing. The hum of the server room felt louder now, like it was closing in on him. He reached for his backup drive, but his hand stopped midair. There was a shadow. Right there by the heavy steel door. It wasn't one of the guards. This man didn't have a uniform. He wore a gray coat, quiet shoes. The kind of man you walk past 1,000 times and never remember. The cleaner. Kasim backed into the corner, his heart hitting his ribs so hard it hurt. He looked for a weapon, a screwdriver, anything. But the man didn't reach for a holster. He didn't move toward Kasim at all. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a single glossy photo, and slid it across the floor. It stopped right at Kasim's boots. Kasim looked down. It was a shot from a bus stop, across town. His brother, Leo, was sitting on the bench, holding a coffee, looking at his watch. He looked normal, safe. But then Kasim saw the red dot. A tiny, laser-focused point of light resting right on Leo's chest. "Harlan Grier doesn't like losing," the man in the gray coat said. His voice was like dry paper, no emotion, no heat. "But he's a businessman, he understands trade." Kasim couldn't speak, his throat was too tight. "One more hack," the man whispered. "One more keystroke, and your brother doesn't just lose his pension, he loses everything." The man checked his watch. "You have 10 minutes to restore the car's ECU and the hospital servers." But then something felt off. Kasim looked at the photo again. Something about the background, the clock on the wall behind the bus stop. It said 4:15. Kasim checked his own watch. It was 10:45. The photo was old, or it was a loop. But then the man's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and frowned. "What happened next wasn't in my brief," the cleaner muttered. He looked at Kasim, truly looked at him. And that's when Kasim realized. Grier wasn't just threatening Kasim's family. He was losing control of his own team. The cleaner stepped back toward the door, but he didn't leave. Why was he looking at the hallway like he was the one being hunted? Kasim gripped the edge of the server rack. The terminal was still dark. But the internal lights in the room, they started to flicker. Slowly. Red. Emergency power was kicking in. But not for the hospital. Someone was rerouting the entire grid. And it wasn't Kasim. The cleaner was still standing by the door. Watching, waiting for Kasim to break. Kasim looked at the photo of his brother again. Then he looked at the server rack behind him. He didn't reach for the keyboard. He reached for a heavy, insulated industrial breaker near the floor. "I don't play for money, Harlan," Kasim whispered. Even if Grier wasn't in the room, Kasim knew he was listening through the wire. He didn't wait for an answer. He slammed the lever down. A sound like a lightning strike ripped through the small room. Blue sparks showered the floor. The hum of the servers didn't just stop, it screamed before it died. The digital evidence, gone. The trace on Kasim's brother, gone. But then the rest of the building followed. Section by section, the hospital went black. The monitors in the hallway, dark. The magnetic locks on the VIP doors, dead. The silence was the loudest thing Kasim had ever heard. He stood there in the pitch black, heart thumping against his teeth. He heard the cleaner stumble, a soft grunt, the sound of a man who suddenly lost his only advantage. But then something felt off. Kasim looked toward the window that faced the street. Down below, the limousine was still sitting there. Harlan Grier had managed to force the door open during the power surge. He was standing on the asphalt, looking up at the darkened hospital, chest heaving. He thought the blackout was his chance to run. But what happened next wasn't supposed to happen. The black SUV, the one Kasim thought was Grier's backup, didn't move toward him to help. It started to crawl. Slowly. No headlights. Just a shadow moving through the dark. Grier started to back away, but he hit the side of his own car. He looked left, then right. In the total darkness of the city block, the predator was suddenly looking over his shoulder. He wasn't the one in control anymore. Someone else had been waiting for the lights to go out. And they weren't wearing a uniform. Kasim gripped the edge of the cooling rack. Who was following Grier into the dark? And why did they want him alone? The SUV's door opened, but nobody stepped out. The interior light stayed off. Something was moving in the shadows behind the vehicle. Kasim realized. The blackout didn't just hide him. It invited something much worse inside the gates. The dark wasn't empty. It was breathing. Kasim moved by touch, left hand on the cold brick, right hand holding a dying flashlight. The steam tunnels under the hospital felt like a different world, hot, wet, the sound of hissing pipes everywhere. "You're late, Kasim." The voice came from a corner where the light didn't reach. "Solomon." The man was sitting on a plastic crate, surrounded by 3 ancient laptops and enough tangled wire to build a new city. He didn't look like an actuary. He looked like a castaway. "The grid is down," Kasim whispered. "The evidence, I had to burn it." Solomon didn't blink. He just tapped a key. A map of the city's electrical infrastructure flickered to life on a cracked screen. "You think you're fighting a man," Solomon said. His voice was thin, shaky. "You think Harlan Grier is the top of the mountain, but look at the ledger." Kasim leaned in. The slush fund from the hospital wasn't a dead end. It was a bridge. The money didn't stop at Grier's accounts. It flowed through them, like water. It went to the mayor's re-election committee. It went to the state utility board. It went to names Kasim only saw on the evening news. Grier wasn't the shark. He was the bait. He was just a mid-level manager, a guy hired to do the dirty work so the real players could stay clean. But then something felt off. Kasim pointed at a red line on the map. It was pulsing. "What's that?" Solomon's face went pale under the blue light of the monitor. "That's the fail-safe," Solomon whispered, "the digital tie-in." And that's when Kasim realized the trap. Grier's private equity firm didn't just own the hospital. They owned the contracts for the city's primary power substation. If they moved against Grier, if they triggered the final exposure protocol, the whole city goes dark, not just for an hour, for weeks. "If we take him down," Kasim said, his voice cracking, "we take the grid with him. Every hospital, every traffic light, every home." Solomon looked at the tunnel ceiling. "Someone is already starting the sequence, Kasim, from the outside." What happened next wasn't a choice. The pipes overhead started to groan, a high-pitched whistle that made Kasim's ears bleed. The pressure was rising. Why was the political machine trying to blow the substation now? They weren't protecting Grier anymore. They were erasing him and everyone near him. "We have to get Nila out." Kasim grabbed his gear. But Solomon didn't move. "Look at the screen, Kasim, the SUV outside." Kasim looked. The doors finally opened. The people stepping out weren't wearing masks. They were wearing suits. City suits. And they weren't looking for Grier. They were looking for the basement. The clock didn't just stop, it disappeared. The engine was screaming. Not the car, the plane. Harlan Grier was on the tarmac, running. He had one hand on his briefcase and the other clutching his chest. He looked small, for the first time. He looked human. But then the hangar lights didn't just flicker, they stayed dead. Kasim was still in the tunnels, fingers trembling as he tapped into the private aviation logs. He didn't call the police, he didn't call the press. He sent one document, the flight manifest. He sent it to a private group chat of Grier's biggest investors, the people who lost everything when the slush fund went dry. Grier reached the stairs of his private jet. He looked back just once. And that's when he saw them. Headlights, dozens of them. They weren't flashing blue and red. They were luxury SUVs, town cars. The people stepping out weren't wearing badges. They were wearing tailored suits and holding tablets. His friends, his partners. The people who used to drink his expensive scotch. They didn't look happy. Grier stepped onto the first stair, but then the pilot pulled the door shut. From the inside, "Open it," Grier screamed. He pounded on the metal. The plane started to taxi. Away from him. The investors were closer now. They weren't shouting, they were just walking. Grier backed away, toward the edge of the runway. But then something felt off. Kasim looked at the thermal feed on his screen. The investors weren't stopping, they were circling. And that's when Grier realized it. The people in the suits, they weren't there to demand their money back. They were the ones who ordered the cleanup in the first place. If Grier talked, they all went down. What happened next was a cold realization. Grier reached into his pocket for his phone, his lifeline. He looked at the screen. A single notification from Kasim. "They aren't here for the ledger, Harlan. They're here for the witness." Grier dropped the phone. He looked at the crowd, then at the dark sky. Why was his own inner circle closing the net? The first investor stepped into the light. He wasn't holding a subpoena. He was holding a single brass key. Kasim gripped the terminal desk. The game wasn't about money anymore. It was about who survived the silence. The wind on the tarmac was cold. Harlan Grier was screaming now. "You think you're smart." He was looking at the empty sky, at the cameras, in the shadows. "You're a bug, a technician. You have nothing." Kasim sat in the dark of the server room. His finger was hovering over a single, glowing key. "I have your voice, Harlan," Kasim whispered. He didn't just press enter. He pushed the slider to the top. Suddenly, the hospital's PA system didn't just hum, it roared. The sound ripped through the VIP wing, the maternity ward, the parking lot. Crack. The sound of the slap. Then Grier's own voice, cold, high definition. "Update the server, Nila, before I update your career into the dirt." But then something felt off. Grier froze on the runway. He looked at his watch. He thought it was just the hospital. He thought he could still buy his way out of the building. And that's when Kasim tapped into the city's emergency broadcast frequency. The grid blackout he triggered earlier. It had forced every local radio station to switch to a single, unified backup channel. Kasim's channel. The audio wasn't just in the halls anymore. It was in the taxis, the late-night diners, the living rooms of every person Grier had ever robbed. "I don't care about the fraud," Grier's voice boomed over the city. "The old man is a ghost. I own the board, I own the law." What happened next was the silence of a city listening. Grier dropped his briefcase. He looked at the investors circling him. They weren't looking at him like a partner anymore. They were looking at a man who had just confessed to a billion-dollar conspiracy on every speaker in the state. They couldn't protect him now. To save themselves, they had to destroy him. But then the transmission flickered. Kasim saw a new spike on the monitor. A different signal was trying to override the broadcast. High-level encryption. The real bosses were finally stepping into the light. Why were they trying to cut the feed now? It was too late for the secret. But it wasn't too late for revenge. Kasim looked at the door of the server room. The handle was turning. Slowly. Someone didn't want him to finish the upload. The progress bar was at 99%. He just needed one more second. Just one. The sound, it was the only thing left. A sharp metallic snap. The handcuffs finally clicked around Harlan Grier's wrists. He didn't fight it. He didn't even look at the officers. He just stared at the ground, at the asphalt where his shadow used to be. But then the real movement started. Kasim watched from the monitor one last time. It wasn't just a police raid. It was a digital migration. Grier's accounts, those offshore millions, the Project Lantern Fund. They weren't just frozen. Kasim had rerouted the final verification codes. He didn't steal the money, he redistributed the logic. The property deeds, the hospital's ownership, even the land Grier's firm had seized from the neighborhood. It all started flowing into a community land trust. Public locked permanent. Grier was being led into the back of a cruiser, and as the door shut, the streetlights hummed back to life. The city was waking up. But something felt off. Kasim looked at his own reflection in the darkened server screen. He was tired. He won, but he'd also burned every bridge he had to get there. He stood up. His legs felt heavy, like he was walking through deep water. He walked toward the service door. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his technician's badge, and looked at it. Kasim Vance, infrastructure support. He didn't put it back in his pocket. He didn't hand it to his supervisor. He just laid it on the empty desk, right next to the brass key he'd recovered. What happened next was the quietest part of the night. He walked out the front door of the hospital. The morning air was sharp, clean. Nila was there. She was sitting on a stone bench, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun hit the glass of the VIP wing. She looked at him. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Kasim kept walking. He didn't go toward the bus stop. He didn't go toward his apartment. He saw a black car waiting at the corner, not a limo, not an SUV. Just a regular car. The driver didn't get out. He just tapped the indicator once. Kasim got in. He looked at the dashboard. There was a new badge sitting there, a different name, a different department. He wasn't fixing cables anymore. Why did the city need someone who knew how to turn the lights out? Kasim didn't ask. He just closed the door, and the car pulled away into the morning light. The technician was gone. The architect was just getting started. You know, we see people like Harlan Grier every day, not always in high-rise offices or tinted limos, but in the way power tries to silence the truth. We think the system is too big to break. We think the little guy is just a ghost in the machine. But tonight, we saw what happens when the ghost decides to speak back. The real lesson here isn't just about the slap or the money. It's about the fact that every giant has a footprint, and every footprint leaves a trail. Grier thought he owned the hospital, the city, even the air Nila breathed, but he forgot one thing. He forgot that the people who build the world are the ones who know exactly how to take it apart. When you see someone using their status to crush someone else, remember Kasim. Remember that silence isn't weakness. It's often just a technician waiting for the right moment to flip the switch. True power doesn't come from a bank account or a title. It comes from the integrity to stand up when the lights go out, and the courage to make sure they never come back on for the wrong people. If this story made you think twice about who's really in control, then subscribe and hit that notification button. This has been another look into the shadows with Alfred Mafia Stories. Keep your eyes open and your signal clear. We'll see you in the next one.